Good evening, everyone. I, Lakshmi Mini, have the honor to extend a warm welcome to our honorable guest for the day, Mr. Rajiv Malhotra. Today, we shall be reviewing his book, AI and the Future of Power, which is already creating ripples in the power corridors of New Delhi. It is indeed an honor for Dras to have the author himself while we review his masterpiece, which is more like an eye opener. Mr. Rajiv Malhotra was trained initially as a physicist and then as a computer scientist specialized in AI. After a successful corporate career in the US, he became an entrepreneur and found many IT firms spread across 20 countries. Since the early 1990s, as the founder of Infinity Foundation, he has been researching civilization and their impact and engagement with technology. He has authored several best selling books. Infinity Foundation has also published a 14-volume series on history of Indian science and technology. His latest book on AI is titled Artificial Intelligence and Future of Power: Five Battleground, in which India is a case study to analyze various impacts of AI in variety of domains. Interviewing him will be Group Captain P. Naidu, who is actually a retired Air Force officer and who later served as Additional Director General in Prasar Bharati in both Doordarshan and All India Radio. He is a member of Bar Council of Delhi, Aeronautical Society of India, Broadcast Engineering Society India, Foundation for Aviation and Sustainable Tourism, Quality Council of India, Honorary Member Advisory Board of MRO Business Today, and Adjunct Professor, Center for Aerospace and Defense Law, Nalsar University of Law. He's also the founder, director of workplace ethics startup known as Clean Exit, and one of the directors of a cybersecurity firm called ISEC. I now request Group Captain Naidu to take the discussion forward.
Thank you very much, Lakshmi. Very good evening, Rajiv sir. Thank you, and it's an honor that you are here with us.
Good evening. Wonderful to be with you, and I'm always interested in pointed questions, agreement, disagreement, whatever, from people who are serious readers. I know you are a serious reader, so I accepted this invite, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, sir. And indeed, hearty compliments on this book, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Power: Five Battlegrounds. Initially, when I heard of this book and when I wanted to read, I was a little hesitant because I'm a non-technical person. I was wondering whether this book will be able to retain my attention for long. Trust me, sir, this book you have really written for non-technical people more than the technical people. For the people who are interested in humanities more than the artificial intelligence and the technology part of it. My interest definitely has grown in artificial intelligence per se in its applications after reading this book, despite the fact that I am aware of certain things in cybersecurity where artificial intelligence was touching some of the points there. Coming to the book per se, very nicely written, 500 plus pages. What a way to describe the chapter at the beginning so that even those people who are very busy can just glance through, take out those nice little points. Of course, there are some serious issues as well you have discussed, and brushing from starting with the jobs that will be created, the jobs that will be lost, to metaphysics, individual, the human being, how he can benefit from artificial intelligence, the benefits of artificial intelligence, while speaking about the perils of misuse. Really, sir, hats off to you. Wonderful narration for a non-technical person. It's a hats off to you, and thank you very much for bringing out this book, sir. Timely, definitely yes.
Let's get started, and I am looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Now, coming to the first part of my questions is that to begin with, I was speaking about the two extremes that you touched. At the lowest level is jobs lost, and upskilling, reskilling that will be required, and going up to the metaphysics. While speaking of those, the positive contribution of AI as well, you use some words which are, to me, appeared strong words. Some of them, some phrases like battlegrounds, some phrases like Google Devta, digital colonization. I mean, a word like moronization of masses, digital dehumanization. what is the object, sir? What is the objective of using such strong words? Is it to awaken the Indian leadership on the urgency and the need to quickly take action? Or is it pointing towards the world as a whole that yes, there's something which is disrupting everyone's life and we are not taking that particular subject seriously? Would you please speak on that, sir?
Yeah, thank you for the good question. Now, you've said that the two extremes are the two ends of the spectrum that I've covered. One is very practical, sthul sharir, physical body of jobs and infrastructure and economy. That is the sthul sharir, the physical body of the Rashtra. All the way to the other side, which is metaphysical spirituality, But I will tell you that what you have not said is the most important part, which is the middle part. In the middle, in between these two, is the psychological mental hacking of the individual. Now, that is not sthula sharir, that is the sukshma sharir, the subtle body of the nation, you might say. The subtle body of Indian public who are being psychologically hacked, mesmerized, put in awe of all this technology, and who are giving up their agency, their free will, who are going on autopilot, default mode. Social media is managing the show, telling what movie to watch and who to get married to and what holiday to go to, what shoes to buy, what religion to convert to, whether to go on a riot in front of Red Fort or wherever. So all of the mental decision making, which could be dangerous also, which could be joyful, so you can enjoy life, you can also get angry. All this management through social media, but social media is driven by algorithms. Social media is driven by algorithms, and algorithms are driven by AI. So this is very important to learn. Artificial intelligence, through the algorithms, is driving the social media, which is changing the behavior. So I would say that the middle between the extreme of the physical level jobs and economy on one side and the metaphysical on the other side is my favorite. Of course, I'm covering all the spectrum and I'll answer whatever questions you have, but my favorite is the middle ground. Now, in this middle ground, we are getting colonized when we are giving up our sovereignty, mental, intellectual sovereignty to these authorities elsewhere. Traditionally, we are supposed to have our own narrative, which our adhikaris, our rishis developed. We have it in our shastras. Our Shastra is not saying the same thing that Wikipedia is saying. It is not saying the same thing, that you will find in a Google search. Our Shastra is saying something, and these authorities, new social media, AI-driven authorities are saying something else. Our authorities, living authority, would be a guru. It would be parents. It would be, those kind of things. But today it is media, social media. What did Siri say? What did Alexa say? What did Google say? So therefore, it is true that they have become like the Devatas, in the sense Devata is someone you never question. Devata, you do not say based on merit, I'm evaluating, he's right on this and he's wrong on that. Devata is always right. So it is a sort of blind faith. So when we give up blind faith to these new sources of authority and information, that, because somebody is very popular on Twitter, it must be right. This thing got so many views, your video got only X views, this one got 100X views, he must be right. When you are going like that, then you are automatically treating these as the Devatas. So when I say Google Devata, Twitter Devata, Facebook Devata, Amazon Devata, and so on, I'm actually saying that our people are treating them like in the tradition we used to treat the Devatas. Because these are the sources that are considered to have, we are in awe of them. We want them to like us, we used to want the Devatas to like us. And just like we do Upasana, we do something, some ritual, some, Agama-based thing to worship and for the Devata, keep him happy. Now with these digital Devatas, we do search engine optimization. We make sure that we say the right things. We don't say something that will block me. What will the expert tells you? The expert is like the new Pandit, the new priest is telling you, no, don't say like this, do like that. Put up your show on this day of the week. Put it up at such and such time of the day. You'll get more views. Make a 2-minute clip and put it on Twitter. So all these tricks, all these techniques, to impress the Devatas is how we are proceeding. So they are like a Devatas, and because we are treating them like that. And moronization means that we have become morons, in the sense that it's like a dumbed down Machines are getting smarter. Machines are getting smarter, absolutely. But human beings are giving up to surrendering their own knowledge to these machines. And a lot of people come and tell me, young people especially, why we need to learn. Why? What's the point of learning all that? We'll ask Google. Sir, we'll ask Google. It will tell us what we need to know. We can even speak and they will tell us. We go to Wikipedia, will tell us why do we need to know. So soon, you'll have a Wikipedia and a search engine, all that wireless transmitter inside you. You don't even have to then type. You just think and it'll give you the answer. So when you are heading for that, why is it I'm just ahead of my time? I don't think I'm creating an unreasonable sensation when I tell that this is how we are headed. This is where we are headed. And the reason I'm trying to do this is not to just wake up leaders, but also wake up the public. You see, the leaders are reflecting in a democracy. The leaders reflect what the public is wanting. You get the leaders that you want because that's who you vote for. So the public has to ultimately take charge because, the young people especially, this is their generation. They are the ones who are turning their sovereignty and their freedom and their agency over to these kind of devatas, digital devatas, and they are getting colonized because the kind of information and the kind of knowledge, the kind of bias being given to them is not as per their own tradition. It is whatever somebody sitting in another part of the world decides. And, so not only are the Indians, getting more and more in the control of this kind of media, which has bias, which is algorithm driven, which is AI driven. But furthermore, these are all foreign controlled. That is very amazing. Now, in the case of China, they are doing all those things with their own, not with American controlled things. They have their own Baidu and Alibaba and all of those kind of guys. So that is the answer to your question. Why am I using all these terms?
Yes, this book definitely has touched a lot of nerves. Right or wrong is a perception, but important nerves definitely this book has touched, is my opinion. And coming to the next question, in case of India, by default or by design, we created a large number of engineering students for over more than 3 decades, starting from 1990s. The STEM education and the quality of education is debatable, that we will not go into it. But these engineers are there. They are there in every walk of life, every field, every government department, the corporates, everywhere they are there. In fact, you are aware of the situation where the postgraduate engineering students are going for even lowly paid government jobs, that you are aware. But they are there. Now, the question is, how can we consolidate on this large pool of engineering students who are doing jobs across? And when you say the people are getting modernized, how do we make sure that these people they are awakened, they are informed, and they become part of this awareness? This is what I request you to answer.
So, the key word that I'll use to answer the question is the word innovation. The people who are educated in these fields are supposed to be innovative. They're supposed to be able to think for themselves. Now, a very small percent of the people who graduate as engineers in India are actually doing engineering. They're doing everything other than engineering. I mean, I know people who are running some business, somebody runs some restaurant chain, somebody doing some business here and there, somebody's in the police service, somebody's in the administrative service, some are corporate people, various middle level. That's nothing to do with engineering, you see. So while India produced a large number of engineering graduates, it did not produce a large number of engineers. There's a difference between a graduate and somebody who's actually doing that. So they have book knowledge, a lot of book knowledge, and they have not been given, the opportunity to actually do real engineering. This says a lot about the kind of education system we have. This education system was created by the British, who openly wrote in the early 1800s, starting with Macaulay and others, that if we give these people an inferiority complex about their own culture and we make them into kind of second-class Englishmen and deny them, creativity and just make them babus and clerks, they can run the country for us. We will be the boss and they will run the country for us. The same way as now, the future is the elite will run the world through algorithms. The algorithms are the babus, the kind of automated babus, because they have the rules and they run the show. Previously, there were no algorithms, so you need human beings and train them with algorithms. So basically, the training of Indians was teach the algorithm. The British told you, do this, do this, do this, do this. This is your job. Don't ask too many questions and don't worry about what the other fellow does. Just do this job. So we continued this education system for 200 years, which is a real shame. Now, people ask me, were Indians ever creative? And they think that it's a fault of our tradition. But I point out that, look at the contributions to astronomy and mathematics and the pioneering in basic, the creators of linguistics and grammar, from Panini onwards and so many others. You look at practical, physical level infrastructure in ancient archaeology, whether it is the Saraswati Indus civilization, Harappa, Dholavira, all those places. You look at the metallurgy in some various sites. And this list goes on. And it spread from India to Southeast Asia, and it went all the way to Afghanistan. All those, before they were destroyed, those places were really part of the Indian landscape. And a lot of this went to the Middle East. A lot of Indian metallurgy went to church bells. The first church bells, when you go and do the metallurgy of the oldest church bells that exist, though that metallurgy is Buddhist. Buddhists used to send bell as a kind of Emperor Ashoka used to send a bell through his ambassadors to all parts of the world with some inscriptions on them. So you will find more than 2,000-year-old Indian metallurgy, not only in church bells, but you will find it in the Roman archives talk about buying this wood steel from India because that was the toughest steel for making swords and shields. So India was a land of innovation. Medicine, so much medicine. So if you look at the innovation of the Indian mind in those times, you cannot say that Indian people are always kind of dumbed down. It is not true. So why this happened, dumbing down during the British era, because it served a colonial ruler to have a lot of people who just follow, instructions, algorithms. Indians are very good at learning an algorithm the master teaches you and carrying it out. This is very Indian, became famous for that. So this is the problem. You cannot be an engineer if all you do is follow some algorithm. You must know how to do engineering as a creative person. So we have to introduce creative thinking to be innovative, to have our patents. So we are not exporting the brains that work under some foreign client and he turns them into people who develop new technology. The Indians, even after so many centuries of being colonized, the basic quality of the human being is very good, because the same Indians, when they go to United States, they go to Silicon Valley, they are the movers and shakers and making all kind of waves. So the problem is in India. The problem is not the Indian individual lacking brains. That's not the problem, because I know enough people all over the world who are doing very well. The problem is somehow in India, we do not have an ecosystem based on merit, based on innovation. And so we are used to very low level expectation. We just teach children something in college, and then they recite it back in some exam and they pass the exam. So, you have large number of, on the one hand, you have large quantity of STEM people, but the quality is not there. So therefore, the challenge is how to change this whole system. We have one government after another. We have one education minister after another promising to do all those things, but they don't do it. I mean, the job is not some state speeches somewhere in parliament or go to some manthan and make some speech and get some big applause. The job is you got to not only redo the curriculum, but you got to train lakhs of teachers. In order to train millions of students, you need to train lakhs of teachers, because, the number of teachers all over from kindergarten all the way to college is large number of teachers. So you got to create a new generation of teachers. Who's going to train the teachers? So you need trainings of teacher institutes with new kind of, and then you'll train the teachers. Then the teachers will then train the students. It'll take a generation. There is no easy solution to this. This is why in my case study, I'm saying that India's problems are very complex, because the challenges, the negative consequences of AI whether it's in the hands of China, Pakistan producing weapons, whether it's in the hands of breaking India forces, creating internal problems, whether it's in the hands of industrialists creating, competitive products which dislocate the old workers and employees, whatever the kind of disruption, the solution to it requires upskilling, and upskilling takes time. So the problem is imminent, short term. The solution is long term. I mean, it's like a doctor says that you got to reduce so many 20 kilos, and problem is like immediate. You have to do it. But he says, sir, even if I starve, I cannot lose 20 kilos in 24 hours. So the problem is more urgent. The solution is going to take long. This is very serious issue. Very serious issue. How to turn India's STEM graduates into functioning engineers, functioning scientists, functioning mathematicians, functioning in some field. So this is the challenge your generation and younger generations have to face. Also concerned about some wrong things that India is doing, which is, for example, turning the IITs into humanities and liberal arts. So what will happen is it all become like Ashoka University and JNU and these kind of places and create Gadar. And so, the STEM requires, if you look at the rise of China, is because they really created scientists and physicists and material scientists and AI people and, engineers, really created a whole generation of that, which is the largest population of actually practicing engineers, not with their degrees, but actually practicing scientists, actually practicing people in those fields is in China. Numerically, and USA is scared of that because US does not have such a large population to produce such a large number of technology people. So India is making a mistake. Instead of upgrading the STEM to higher quality, more innovativeness, more patents, and have incubators, have projects, like when you go to Stanford or MIT or Carnegie Mellon or Princeton University right here, as an undergraduate, you're innovating, you're inventing things, you're already doing startups here and there. Venture capital is coming to you, funding you and all that, undergraduates even. So instead of creating that, the Indian government is now saying, let's turn them into some humanities and social sciences people. It's a bad idea. The social sciences people are third-rate standard. I mean, I'm sorry. I talk to a lot of social sciences people. They are third-rate standard by international levels. They are just copycatting the social science taught in the West. They're teaching that in India. There is nothing, they don't understand their own society except through the lens of the Westerners. So these social sciences kind of bringing some extreme Marxist and postmodernist and post-colonialist type of view, subaltern view, are disconnected from the traditions of India itself. In India has its own social sciences. So social sciences got enough problems of their own. And AI, I'm also writing on how artificial intelligence is revolutionizing the social sciences. Revolutionizing, even in the West. So let's say the old social sciences which are in the West, let's call it 1.0. And let's say AI is going to create a social sciences 2.0 in the West. It's happening. While in India, we are still on the Western 1.0 social sciences, which came a long time ago. Those 1.0 social sciences, we are now going to take over into the STEM also, which is a stupid thing to do. While the rest of the world is upgrading, is considering those social sciences to be obsolete and upgrading those to the new AI-based social sciences, we in India are going to take the engineering people and turn them into the old-fashioned social sciences. It's a strategic blunder that the education ministry is doing, and nobody has done a critique of it in this particular way. And I wanted an audience. I've not been given an audience. So this is why I'm going to the public. So I think the education system continues to have very serious problems.
Many of the countries, in fact, smaller countries like UAE, they have ministers in charge of the artificial intelligence exclusively.
Yes.
A nation like India, the AI construct is actually starting and spearheaded by Niti Aayog, which is a recommendatory body, which is not an executive body. Now, for the governance part, do you suggest that we should have a structure which is categorically addressing this particular disruptive technology known as artificial intelligence?
Yes. So United States has created, under the Obama administration, National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, headed by Eric Schmidt, who was CEO of Google. Okay, and he's a scientist himself before he became a businessman and is worth tens of billions of dollars. He quit Google and Google board and all the positions in Google during, and 2 presidents back, he went to the president and reporting straight to the president's office. Then when Trump came into power, they continued and raised the funding, and now Biden is in power, they continued and raised the funding. So this is the 3rd president in a row respecting this commission and going on expanding their funding. You should read their reports. Their most recent report came out like March 1. It's over 850 pages. It's a very, very strong. Everybody who's interested in AI in the world should read that report. How they've understood China, how they've understood where they are, what is the scope, what is the role of the government. Now, that is what a commission, a government level commission should do in India. There is such a thing in Britain also. So we have had success when Bhabha created this Atomic Energy Commission. In fact, for this AI book, one of the persons in interview discussion with me was Mr. Kanetkar, who's chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, retired. He did this with me, and he also said, I asked him point blank, I said, isn't the success of atomic energy due to that commission? He said, yes. I said, then why don't we create one for AI? He said, we should. And then a Space Commission with Satish Dhawan, who very close to my family, because he and my father went to Government College Lahore before partition. So I knew him as a young boy. So, these are 2 examples where India did it right. Now, as far as Niti Aayog is concerned, quite honestly, I'm very disappointed. They are not AI people. They are not computer science people. They are not technocrats. They are some government type, IS type people or whatever they are, economist type people. They do not have operational responsibility. They have no experience of having actually built anything. They just sort of, and what they are doing, rather than bringing in real experts, they are bringing in Google and Microsoft and Intel to tell them what to do. So they are going to the devatas. They are going to the foreign devatas and saying, "Acha, you please tell us because you are so good. If the devata blesses, then we must be good. So we give you the prasad. You please tell us what prasad you need. We will arrange it, and we'll do this yagna to you. So you look after us." This is very stupid. And then to cover themselves that nobody can say you're wrong and all, they're quoting McKinsey report. So they hired McKinsey, which is a international organization serving the multinationals. They are not serving the Aam Aadmi. They have no experience. McKinsey got 0 experience going to villages or going to where the migrant workers are, asking the migrant workers, how will it impact you? Going down to the panchayat level, going down to the unions of workers who may be affected by it. They have no experience in, how this technology is being used and misused by breaking India forces to convert people, to make them change their identity. McKinsey doesn't know any of that. And then they are relying on people like PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young. So it is these very international, Western-based, corporate, advisors who are good at advising multinationals all over the world, so I can see Reliance will use them and Tata's will use them because there's this top-down view how to, use the technology, make more money. But those people who are looking after the Rashtra have to look after the public at large, not just corporate people. Corporate people have enough to look after themselves. They have to look after the Rashtra. And to quote for the nation's epic planning organization, to quote these kind of sources as their gospel, this is sort of this is the Shastra. What McKinsey wrote is like the Shastra. Wow, this is McKinsey report. With that much, they're doing it. So I went and I've tried to talk to the people who write these reports. They're not interested in coming and discussing anything publicly with me because they don't want to face all these questions. When you look at the methodology, which is always required in the back of the book, at the back of the report, they say, what is the methodology? The methodology says they have gone and interviewed 200 HR departments of the big multinationals. Now tell me, you go to the 200 HR departments of multinationals, they're going to give you the top-down view of what's going on. Not only multinationals in India, but if you take a look at, all Sensex companies, all corporate Sensex companies, all the organized sector, the total employees Please note this. The total number of employees hired by all of these companies combined is less than 10% of India's workforce. The other 90% are self-employed, small enterprise, micro, medium-sized enterprises. They're not on Sensex. They're not publicly traded. They're not part of this HR department. They're not known to the McKinseys of the world, or they don't send their people to World Economic Forum. So this very trying to be part of this global elite, that India thinks that way we become Vishwa Guru because we go to World Economic Forum and our people go there and stand on the stage and make a speech. That is complete phony. That is completely wrong. India needs to build bottom up. India needs to build its economy and its society and its education system bottom up. That's what China did for 50 years. They built bottom up. Whether it is sports to be number one in the world in Olympics, whether it is increase the math and be one of the top math countries in the world, or STEM countries in the world, or largest number of AI patents in the world, or whatever field you look at, they build bottom up, and that takes time. That is not instant solution. It is not glamour. For one generation, it is not glamorous. And like the iceberg, the tip is only visible, that's little bit, but beneath is the big mountain. So you have to create a whole society like that, with hard work. We have not done that. So we are doing the jugaad of quick results. And these quick results are that we look after the top. So governance in India, to come to the point, the governance in India, when it comes to AI, is in the hands of non-AI specialized people. And even these non-AI specialized people have never implemented, executed, operated in terms of actually things on the ground. And furthermore, these are top-down elite people, aligned with elite people for their sources. So there's three problems. They're not subject matter experts. They have no skin in the game as far as actual execution is concerned. And they are totally aligned with and using the authority and the brand name of these international elites top down. These three are disqualifiers for leaving it in the hands of Niti Aayog. The longer India leaves it in the hands of Niti Aayog, the longer it will take to get AI really started in a serious way. So they should create a national commission on artificial intelligence. And my recommendation is that they should appoint somebody, a retired senior military official, military people. I find among all the people, the reason I accepted this invite, because you're defense related people, and I'm being interviewed by the Indian Army training headquarters in Shimla. They're top people. I like dealing with the military people. Similarly, simply because they are action oriented. They're practical thinking. You tell them practical thing, they understand it. They're not going to go into some poetry and some, some very fuzzy duzzy, kind of 5,000 years ago, we scored sixers, so why we need to worry, that kind of a thing. They are practical people. They see what's happening on the ground, and you can talk logic to them. You can get ahead with you can get some traction talking to them. So I think that if they were to appoint somebody from the industry, it will be a different agenda. If they appoint somebody who's pure scientist and academic people, they are too narrow. They don't have that kind of an experience of getting things in. I'm talking about just AI. At least I don't know somebody who's a computer scientist, a pure academic computer scientist who could do this. But I think the military people and the stakes of India in artificial intelligence are huge amount of stake for defense. Huge amount of stake for defense. And the defense industry is the one group of people in India who understand this. Others I talk to, they're still kind of confused. Some of them think that this is science fiction, that maybe 100 years from now it will happen and all, we don't have to worry about it. And some of them go into some very emotional, abstract, philosophy and all that. But I would say, I would put my bet on some good military people to run this and give them a free hand and not locate them in Delhi, but like Bhabha Atomic Research was Mumbai or area and Bangalore area for space, they should pick some place which is not those two or Delhi, but some other place, and create a AI commission and give them freedom and give them a lot of funding. This is what India needs to do.
there is a convergence of technologies that is happening when we are talking about AI. AI is leading the other disruptive technologies, the industry 4.0 technologies that they call. I mean, there are a set of host of things that you have spoken in your book also. Now, armed forces across the world spearheaded the adoption of new technologies always. But in the present case of these disruptive technologies, we see a little shift. The corporates, even startups, are taking lead, and armed forces are not at the lead. Whether it is internet revolution or any other revolution, we see the defense, whether it is in US or elsewhere, they were the ones who were leading. Today, the shift has taken place. How do you correct it? So how do we think we can correct it?
So first thing I want to correct is the track record, because in the United States, DARPA, which is Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, that is Defense Department, they invented the internet. It used to be called DARPANet, and then they dropped the D and called it ARPANET and made it available on a selective basis, not available to the public. Then it became internet. So when I tell people the year in which I used internet, people say, oh, no, there was no internet, because they look up internet started in a certain year. But before that, the same thing was called ARPANET, and I used it. And before that, it was called DARPANET. And I was a graduate student with my professor involved in this kind of research. And so I had a security clearance. I used it. So I did use the internet before it was called internet. And I know that this is a DARPA invention. DARPA also invented semiconductors, because the transistor, for which Bell Labs got a Nobel Prize, and laser, for which Charles Towns and Bell Labs got the Nobel Prize. Fiber optics. I was in ITT, and the gentleman adjacent to me was a Chinese American patent holder for ITT under defense contract doing fiber optics. He later got the Nobel Prize in physics for fiber optics. You look at night goggles, another technology that ITT, when I was there, we had for F-16 fighters, for goggles for army people, and then speech recognition, because the fighter pilot, they wanted that he should be able to speak the command and not use his hands, because his hand will be free to do other things. And so certain commands, they wanted speech recognition. And so all these technologies, now DARPA doesn't do its own research only. CIA has many of its own ventures, but DARPA gives it to defense contractors. The defense contractor industry is a $500 billion industry in the United States. It's a very big industry. All these Boeing, Defense, and Grumman, and Lockheed Martin, all these kind of McDonnell Douglas, all these companies that you look at in aerospace, that are the cutting edge of aerospace, are very heavily defense related and avionics related. So I would say that the backbone of technology in the United States has been defense. In AI now, when you look at AI, a lot of research in quantum computing is being funded by the military people. The military people is looking at implants for soldiers and for all these things to, improve their functionality and create a futuristic, futuristic brain that has got all these technologies is part of their mind and brain and access to so much information. So don't count them out, because the CIA has a venture capital fund. I don't know if you know this. The CIA has multiple venture capital funds, and the details on where they're investing are kept secret. But they give money to startups, private startups, and those guys have to keep their mouth shut, and they're working for the CIA. Then 5, 10, 15 years later, this will get declassified and the corporate sector will get access to it. So there is one flow of technology which goes through classified, military, government, and then it gets declassified. But you're also right that the amount of the AI investment by Google and Microsoft and Facebook and particularly Apple and Amazon is huge. I mean, each one of them is spending many times what all of India is spending on basic research. So the corporate sector is very big also. So in the US, you have these. Now in China, the military, industrial, academic complex. In US also, military, industrial, academic complex. They're together. So China also. India, they're separate silos. The DRDO is separate. They may be giving a little bit of grant here and there to private sector. Maybe some IIT guy gets a small grant. He's got 5-10 techies working for him, but nothing to build a big, huge system, you know. So the DRDO is separate. The industry does very little research. In India, the industry does not do research. It's a service economy model, which is not innovation-based, not patent-based. It is basically providing services. You hire people and you rent them out, rent the brains to some American guy, and then they build the technology. So Indian brains working for foreign entities, building the technology. It's all over. It's happening all over the place. As far as academics is concerned, there's hardly any research. They are more into gundagardi and campus riots and politics and all that. The academic is mainly to teach. But in the United States, the academic is also to do research. So when they rank, the reason the Indian universities don't rank very high is because they rank based on published output. They don't rank based on what is your curriculum and students you're producing. If they ranked on the quality of students, then Indian university would rank good, because the IITs would do well and IIMs would do well because their graduates would doing very well in various places. 99% of the college products are not that same caliber, but the 1% who come from good places are good students. They have good brains. They work hard. However, when you are looking at international standards of academics, it's based on research output of the faculty, and India is very low on that. Very low in the rankings. Hardly any university will be in the top 50 or 100 or something like that, because they're not doing research. So you see, the problems in India have to do with not enough research. That is the key problem. That is the key problem. So, you know, you need a governance that is research oriented. And and you know, when you say Atmanirbhar, that is fantastic, but that has been limited to manufacturing. It doesn't. So you are Atmanirbhar, making something, but you are buying foreign technology to make it. Do you understand the difference?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
for instance, when India does electric vehicles, when they make electric cars, Mahindra, the lithium ion technology is mainly Chinese have got most of the patents.
Yes.
And a few other people have patents. And the lithium, which is the material with the actual substance needed, 50% of the world lithium supply is controlled by China. Only 11% is the Chinese own mining of lithium in their own country. But the rest of it, they bought off the mines in Africa, here, there, Latin, wherever in the world, whether it's Australia, if they found a lithium mine, they'd buy it off. And they've collected, while they're doing research, and they put a big bet on the future is going to be this, they started collecting all the patents, so people have to license from them, and they started collecting all the mines, so they own half the world's supply. So Chinese are very clever. They make long-term bets. So, you know, the governance also has to include people who know what are the long-term bets.
Now,
so you realize China made the bet that on robotics. Now they have more robots than US and Europe combined. They made a bet on drones, so they're the largest supplier of drones. They made a bet on solar panels. They're the largest supplier of solar panels. They made the bet on electric vehicles. Even Tesla's biggest factory is in China. The first factory is in China. Because Elon Musk, who knows very well that if he keeps Chinese happy, they'll keep giving him the lithium. So he's also a smart guy. He says, oh, I love these Chinese guys, because it's not because he goes and enjoys Chinese food. I'm sure he does that also. But he knows that keeping them happy, then the lithium supply is guaranteed. Hey, smart fellow. So, you know, Chinese make some big bets. Oh, now we are supposed to be the software superpower of the world. Come on, if we are software superpower of the world, how come in AI we are 10 years behind? I mean, AI is a product of computer science. So if you are software superpower, you should be AI superpower. So these are serious problems to do with governance. And these are problems that I do not think the Niti Aayog type people know enough how to solve these.
There are a couple of things that I would have liked to ask you, sir, because personally also being involved with workplace ethics around AI, the legal issues around the AI, but you know, paucity of time maybe. Now coming to the last question to you, sir, two parts it has. One is the military leadership. What are the suggestions that you would like to give to the military leadership as far as application, first of all R&D, and then application of AI is concerned. Two, the impact of this on the foot soldiers, the infantry, the numbers. What are your views on this?
So, if you analyze India's army budget, total military budget, it's very heavily skewed towards manpower. And the manpower budget includes, pensions for retired people. And of course, you have to look after people. I fully agree with that. I think India should look after its military. I am very pro-military in wherever I'll tell you, when I was in India for first 20 years, I was not fond of military because they didn't respect military in India. I came to the United States and I started respecting military. My attitude towards military changed because I saw how, for instance, at ITT, from the chairman down, they're all military people, ex-West Point graduates. And I didn't know how smart they are. The military training is very smart because you learn technology, you learn how to articulate, you learn management, you learn operations, you learn how to run a big multinational because the military in the US is a big, giant multinational. And so you learn all kinds of things, and they are very, very intelligent and smart people. And I've changed my attitude towards military people. And ever since I started noticing that military people are very action oriented and they're very, very good. So when I come to India, one of the things I advocate is that India should respect its military more. India should have more military budget. India should understand that these guys are not just some soldiers standing out there and facing bullets and all that. Of course, he's doing, but these are also very smart people, and they know what they're doing. So India should look after its manpower, military manpower. But the problem is that the huge percent of the budget which goes to support the manpower leaves very little for R&D and new technology. So if you take out all the manpower, then the next is supplies, because after all, not only you have to look after manpower, you got to look after the supplies, whether it is, uniform, whether it is whatever, ammunition, that supply is very important. Then procurement of new weapons is what I'm talking about. Then that procurement of new weapons, only tiny percent of the total military budget in India is left to procure new weapons. And then in that, some of the weapons are conventional weapons. You need to buy all these conventional weapons. And then the question is, how much is left? So what is left? The military wants to buy imported stuff. Naturally, they are right, because the imported stuff will protect the country. The Indian DRDO had not produced cutting edge weapons. This Arjun tank, 1MA or something like that, the name for this new Arjun tank, they showed it on Republic Day. I don't have the number correct. The army is buying, 110 of them or whatever they're buying, but they're buying thousands of Russian tanks. You can't blame them. So they're buying the LCA, the light, the Tejas. They'll buy a certain number of squadrons of that, but they want to really buy the Rafale because that is what's going to protect them against foreign, countries. So what has happened is India's lagged behind R&D, and therefore the weapons have to be bought. So Israel supplies the avionics. A small country like Israel supplies the avionics. You look at Taiwan, is the world number one in semiconductor. Taiwan, small country, So it's not like we couldn't have afforded it. We needed brains. We needed to make the right bets. I remember when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, he made a trip to US. It was covered in one of the Indian newspapers that he went to some place, I don't know where it was, Texas or wherever it was. And somebody said that, why doesn't India invest in semiconductor chips? And he made a joke out of it, saying, I don't care whether it is potato chips or semiconductor chips, I don't care. It's kind of a silly, stupid thing, because somebody said it'll cost $10 million or $20 million. Okay. Now, $20 billion would be just the entry price to get into that field today, because but we could have invested in the early days. And like we invested in atomic energy, we made the good bet in space because of Satish Dhawan's persistence, and we made because of Homi Bhabha, we made this bet in atomic energy. Thank God, because suppose India had not done it. But with all the stupidity and other decisions that Nehru made, all of that, at least in those two areas, he listened to the smart guys. He did not listen to his babus. He listened to those scientists. And therefore, we are at least happy that in those two areas, we got a good start. Now, the same could have happened with the AI also. But we did not make these bets. In the long ago, in decades ago, in space and atomic energy, we started those commissions, we made those bets. But in the last, I would say 10, 15 years, when it's been this whole AI thing coming up, India did not make the big bets. What was India doing? India was praising, besides these foreign digital devatas, we also have the Indian billionaire devata. The Indian billionaire who made his billions selling labor to the Americans. They hired an Indian guy for $10,000 a year, software guy, and they sell him for $30,000, $40,000, and they make a ton of money. And this is not because they are brilliant people, but they know how to get visas, and they know how to do HR, how to hire these people, how to sell them. So this business of buying the top brilliant brains cheap and selling them for a higher price, making money, created billionaires. It created, all sorts of, whether it is TCS, whether it is, Infosys or, Mahindra, and all these labor arbitrage, export software, export tech, export people. That's what they did. So India was busy doing that rather than innovating. India did not take that money and reinvest it into R&D. China took the money from cheap factory labor. They sold cheap factory labor to the Americans so they would bring all their factories to China. Very smart of the Chinese. And then whatever somebody put the manufacturing in China, the Chinese would quickly figure out the engineering and figure out how to make it, copycat it on their own and beat the Americans. They were smart in that. And then they took that profit, and more than half of that profit they invested in futurist technologies. All the bets I told you, they were funded. All the big Chinese technology bets were funded from the profits they made from the Americans only. So they took their profit by selling cheap labor to the Americans, invested it in futurist technologies, stole a lot of our knowledge and information from the Americans only to go ahead to beat them, their own clients. India didn't do smart things, futuristic things with our early success. We did have early success. We were justified in calling ourselves software superpower, but we did not know how to keep that lead. We did not go up the value added curve. We just kept selling bodies. Even today, when you ask Niti Aayog, what is the AI strategy? Ask NASSCOM, what is the AI strategy? Ask FICCI, what is the AI strategy? Do you know what they tell you? They tell you we are going to upskill our people and hire and rent them out to Microsoft and Google and to the Americans, because we will create the largest supply of labor. So supplying labor is our strategy. Come on. And in my book, I've criticized this guy, Kotak. I've forgotten his first name, the head of Kotak. I've named him and I've criticized him because I've quoted him saying that his dream is that the youth of India should not only be the urban youth working for Microsoft, but also the villagers should be working for Microsoft. We should upskill the villagers so that we can work for Microsoft. Now, I call this the Shudrafication of India. It means you're turning them into labor class. You're turning them into people rather than being Vishwa Guru, we're becoming Vishwa Kuli. Because the whole strategy of the country is to, train, educate our youth so that they can get a foreign company as the employer. This is a bad strategy. I'm sorry, this is a bad strategy. You have to have innovation for India. Atmanirbhar should be also R&D Atmanirbhar.
Good evening, Sri Malhotra, sir.
Wonderful to meet you, Commander.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I've been waiting for a long time for this opportunity. Thank you very much for giving us your time, sir. I will quickly take the two questions I have. I have many questions, but I will shorten them to two. One is, both of them are related to AI. One is about Elon Musk and his disruptive technologies. You have not mentioned anything about it in your book. But though I may sound a bit of a fantasy, I think he is making transformers. Don't you think so, sir?
So are you talking about BMI, the brain implant?
Yes, that is one. Then the retrievable rockets, and then the cyber trucks and all those things.
So I mentioned the BMI in my in chapter 5. I mentioned this. So for people who don't know, there are many breakthroughs coming which will produce products between 2025 and 2030. These products will come. Brain implants are now the artificial intelligence is measuring, these implants are able to measure the neural burst of the how the neurons burst when you have a thought, when you have a euphoric thought, a fearful thought, an angry thought, a negative thought, depending on the kind of thought, what is the burst of neurons. Because it's so complicated, you cannot decipher it manually. So the AI system is being used for that. And they're recording what is the burst for, one person, what is the burst in Rajiv's case, what is the burst in somebody else's case, because while there are generic patterns, it's also very personalized. Each person's brain is very unique. So AI system does that. And then the AI system can figure out by measuring whether you're in a good mood, bad mood, all that stuff. And AI can also change your mood because it can play a happy burst. It can play the burst which will be happy for you or sad for you or not so angry for you. Or if you're suicidal, turn it into a happy thought rather than let you commit suicide. If you're about to get angry, it can figure it out. So all this mind control, mood control can be used medically for depression, for suicide, for people with bipolar, for military people with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. That is what can be used for the military. Pentagon is also doing this research. And so under this pretext, they'll get FDA approval. These things will be medically important. The moment these things are medically certified, then they'll also, the next wave will be entertainment. They will also be possible that you can have a fantasy, you can fantasize something. They'll give you that kind of experience through these implants. And these implants don't need wire, they are wireless. So you can also control them with whether it's a remote, whether it is somebody sitting somewhere else who hacks you, who hack your brain. So we are headed for an amazing, new frontier where humans augmented with AI, artificially augmented humans with implants will be able to do different things. Just recently, military, US military, disclosed something. I've tracked it for a couple of years, but they disclosed something to the TV show 60 Minutes that they have now developed a very tiny implant. It is like 1-2 millimeters under the skin, which is continuously, perpetually doing blood tests. Lot of complicated, it's looking for certain patterns and transmitting to a patch outside your body or to your phone or to some device, anything warning that you need to know. So the military is going to put it in soldiers so that they can know before something happens that this is an early warning, that this soldier needs rest or needs medical care. So this will improve the health of soldiers. So you can imagine the future of implants, whether it is blood, whether it is neuron. Initially, the technology will be augmented. It will be wearables outside the skin, wearables in your gloves, wearables, augmented reality here. So going from a laptop and handheld smartphone apps to the apps that are wearables and augmented wearables. Then next level is apps inside your body. So that is happening. That disruption I've talked about. I did not go into the details because it's already a large book and I want to write other books in the future. Now, as far as space is concerned, the reusability of space vehicles is something that ISRO should be worried about, because the economics of space is going to change in such a fundamental way that while ISRO did a lot in terms of a certain genre, a certain platform of technology did very well. Now the technology is changing. This Virgin Galactica is going to start space tourism. I actually have bought a seat on Virgin Galactica. When they started, they're selling seats for future civilians to fly. And so I got myself one of those seats early. They've closed now, but there's a waiting list of people who've registered and got themselves a seat. So in the next 2-3 years, when they start commercial flights, then they will start taking batches of people into space. So there's going to be a whole tourism industry which will give them the money to do more research. So whether it's Elon Musk or a few others like that, there are 2-3 major companies doing this commercial space. That's a very big disruptive technology. So I'm into this in a big way. Also, I'm looking at how to use disruptive technology in India for India. And the interesting thing is that venture capitalists only want what will make money in 3 to 5 years. They're not looking for a 5 to 10 year horizon. That's strange. And the Ministry of Culture, Education Ministry, Ministry of Science, Technology, all these places, they're not really into all that. So India does not have a whole lot of interest right now in technologies which are, not current generation that will give you return by 2025, but the next generation that will be from 2025 to 2035. That period, 2025 to 2035, will be a whole lot different than the period between now and 2025, which is also going to be very different. So it depends on how futuristic you want to get. The United States is leading the world again in the futurist disruptive technologies, and lots of them.
Thank you very much, sir, for that elaborate answer. One final question, sir. It is actually an initiative which we have begun. I'd like your opinion on that. You have talked about algorithms and how it changes the actual thinking of the people. We have started an initiative to develop our own algorithm using Nyaya Shastra. We thought it was good because it has got very excellent classification and of ideas and how things should be shown and seen and heard. Would like your opinion on that, sir. Thank you, sir.
I would love to have you send me that. I will take the time and read it. I have been reading similar things for quite a while and doing my own thinking and connected with a small number of people very quietly, very privately, sharing my thoughts with them. If you have a group which is doing this, I would love to get your, send me a private email. Your organizers here have my private email ID. So send me a private email and make sure you remind me that this is a follow-up to our conversation, because I get a lot of emails. I can't read all of them, but I want to read this one. If you send me an email with what your thoughts are, what your developments are in this area, I would love to give you my feedback, my evaluation. We can have a phone call. This is a topic very dear to me. I'm looking at ideas from Sankhya for AI, because Sankhya has got a lot of theories of mind, and right now the mind sciences that are being used for AI are Western neuroscience models of mind, which is a very materialistic model of mind. But also there is a lot written by Sri Aurobindo in his ideas of consciousness, and a whole lot in Shaivism that is about the nature of consciousness. I think this is not that's such a huge topic. It needs its own discussion. If you're interested, let's have a discussion just on that. I would love it. Yes. But I am thinking, I have a lot to say on that, which some of it I don't want to disclose publicly, but people who are very interested, I'll certainly want to talk to them about it. I don't want to disclose it publicly for the simple reason that I've had a bad experience. There's a lot of people who are going around giving a quick video here and make a tamasha show in some YouTube and here, write a blog and all that. I don't want to trivialize this knowledge with the people who aren't really deeply involved in it, but just want to get some mileage and show off. I don't want to do that. So I want to keep it under wraps, work with only a few people until this thing is ready, and then we can announce in a big way. So if you would like to participate in that, or you have some ideas or some people, I would absolutely love to hear from you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. I'll certainly email you through the organization. We do have some ideas which are still in the breaking stages, but I will communicate with you so that we'll value your advice on that. Thank you very much.
Yes, and people who are creative, thinking out of the box, I want to nurture them. My foundation has in the past given substantial support to people doing pioneering work. Then I took it to the Ministry of Science and Culture Ministry and Education, HRD Ministry, expecting they'll help me, but they talked and made me go around here, there, and I got sick and tired of it. So I'm now back in a mode where I'm developing these with some smart people, and then we'll take it forward. We'll take it forward. Once we are absolutely ready, then we can take it forward.
Nasti vidya samam chakshu, nasti satya samam tapaha, nasti raga samam dukkham, nasti tyaga samam sukham. Knowledge is the greatest I. Truth is the highest penance. Attachment is the biggest pain. Renunciation is the highest happiness. On behalf of Defense Research and Studies, I would like to thank our senior advisor, Mr. Rajiv Malhotra, for spending time with us and enlighten us on his new book. We, Defense Fraternity, are extremely thankful to you to deliberate the impact on military as the advent of AI. It was an amazing experience to hear you talk some crucial points and facts which we think all Indians must be aware of. And special thanks to Group Captain P. Naidu for being an exemplary host. As this discussion culminates, we want to thank Infinity Foundation who made this initiative possible today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me. Namaste to everybody, all the viewers. You are a great organization. Let's work together. I was planning on coming, but because of COVID spike, they advised me to delay. But I will come later on. It's a matter of time. I will come. And I want us to be doing some other important things also, research-wise. And also, let's have some conferences. Let's produce some good provocative reports and really make it difficult for people to ignore all this. We have to make our views non-ignorable.
Yes.
That's so people have to think. And that's all our job is, to make people think, because India is a smart country, intelligent people. And once you wake them up and people start thinking for themselves, lots of solutions will come. Thank you very much.